Hello and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast in which we explore all things Beatles, anything to do with the group, the soloists, their past, present, future if we can figure it out. I'm joined by my regular co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you may also know as the host of the syndicated Beatles radio show Every Little Thing. Hey Ken, how you doing?
Good, Alan. Hi, guys.
And Steve Marinucci, who writes the Beatles Examiner columns and several other Examiner columns on the web. Hey, Steve, how you doing?
Hi, Alan Kozin, who you didn't introduce.
Right.
I'm fine. How are you?
Oh, everybody knows me. And Al Sussman, the executive editor of Beatle Fan and an author in his own right. How you doing, Al?
Hey, Alan. Hello there, everybody.
Okay, and I apparently am Alan Kozin. And we also have...
Or Alan Kozin remixed.
Remixed, yes, that's right.
There we go.
I should change my name officially to Alan Kozin Remixed. We also have today with us a very special guest, the very prolific Bruce Spizer, who's here to talk about his really whole library of books, some of which are now being sort of reincarnated in digital form as PDFs with new information and new pictures, things like that. And Bruce, I think you're going to be at Beatlefest coming up, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I think Al may know my schedule better than I do, but I will be doing a panel sometime on Friday evening with Al about the year 1966. I'll be giving a presentation on Saturday on the Butcher cover, which will be an audio-visual presentation. And then I think I'll be talking about the Capitol albums on Sunday. So, at least that and maybe some more things.
Okay, and you were just in the Grammy Museum's show too, weren't you?
Yes, they had a symposium co-sponsored with Delta State University and the new Grammy Museum in Cleveland, Mississippi. And it was a really fabulous facility. It's about a 2-hour drive from Memphis, about a 5-hour drive from New Orleans, and there are all sorts of historical Mississippi blues sites along the way. So it currently has the Traveling Wilburys, or actually the Traveling Beatles exhibit, and it'll be there for the next couple of months before it moves on to another location. If you haven't seen the Beatles exhibit, it's a wonderful opportunity to see it and also take in a really great new museum. And close to the museum in Cleveland, Mississippi, is the B.B. King Museum, about 30 minutes away. So if you're into blues music and the Beatles, it's a perfect combination.
Mm-hmm. Now, we spoke to Jude Kessler a few weeks ago before this event happened, and she was telling us about some of the things they were going to have. Now that it's happened, how did it go from your perspective?
I think it really went well. The speakers all, I think, did a good job. They have a little auditorium there that was used for the speakers, and I gave 2 tours of the exhibit itself, where I could point out certain pieces that I had more knowledge of than the actual, you couldn't really in the museum do a big write-up about certain items. So I think it was a lot of fun. I think the people who went to it had a lot of fun, and it was topped off with a Beatles tribute band playing a concert after the speakers. So I think everyone who went had a really good time. And as I've said, I was very impressed with the museum itself.
Was it well attended, and how would you describe the audience? Was it old people like us, or a lot of young people, or a good mix?
I think mainly older people, although there were a lot of students there and some people that brought their kids along. So, it's like any Beatles convention where you have multi-generational would be the best way to describe it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Bruce, how would you compare the Grammy Museum to, say, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
I think this museum, when it gets more exhibits and things in place, will be right up there with it. The layout's really simple. It's on one floor, so you're not going up and down steps or elevators, and I think that aspect of it's really nice. It has just a nice physical appearance. It's very clean, and
yes.
the people there are very friendly. being from the South, I can say without a doubt that Southern people are of a very friendly nature and very helpful. So, I think that it would be a great trip for somebody who you could start, in the words of Mata Hoople, all the way from Memphis and kind of, do your Elvis and Son record thing in Memphis and then work your way down to Cleveland and work your way down to New Orleans. It'd be quite a trip.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask Bruce how it compares to the L.A. Grammy Museum, but you said it's only on one floor.
Yeah, but only on one floor, but it's a big floor. So I don't think it's as many exhibits at this time, but I think as far as going to see it, it's really very convenient. They have a lot of interactive things, and one of the things they have that I'm not sure if it's in L.A., but it might be because I've been to L.A. a few times, but don't remember everything in it, is a room where you can go in it and hear how certain albums would have sounded had they been on a cylinder, on a 78 RPM disc, on an album, on a cassette, and then a 5.1 surround mix. So I thought that was kind of interesting to hear the evolution of the musical formats.
I don't remember seeing that when I was in LA, but they may rotate things around. But
well, this is kind of a new thing that's will be permanent at that museum.
Boy, that does sound nice.
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be exciting for anyone who's young, who doesn't know the whole history of how recorded music began, and to hear what music sounded like then on disc and then further on up. So
it really is. I mean, to give you an idea of the perspective, I was giving a talk at a Beatles convention one time, and I was talking about the Beatles 45s, and some young kid said, the Beatles had guns?
Oh, boy.
All right.
Wow.
So, Bruce, you've been focusing lately a bit on the Butcher cover, and it's going to be one of your talks, as you said. Can you give us some sort of idea of what you've been finding about it?
Well, the thing was that for many, many years, people felt that the story was that the Beatles were tired of Capitol chopping up their albums, in effect butchering their albums, so they got this great idea to pose for a picture with raw meat to send the message of Capitol butchers the Beatles. And Brian Epstein, their manager, was into pop art and sick humor, so Brian was in favor of the cover. And Mojo Magazine and others have gone to say that Paul was the Beatle who was behind it. And, of course, that when the cover had to be pulled from the market, the Beatles were hastily gathered together again to get their picture taken around a steamer trunk, and if you look at their expressions, you can see they're upset with the Butcher cover having been recalled. And that's a story that's been out there for years.
That's right.
Of course, none of that's true.
Right.
Very little of it. So the true story, as many people know, the starting point is that Bob Whitaker was hired by Brian to take pictures of the Beatles, and his first session produced the cover to Beatles 65. And it was the four seasons. If you look at the cover, you see winter, spring, summer, or fall, or as Carole King would say, all you have to do is call. And so Bob Whitaker, a year later, got a little bit more creative in that he had them with tin foil, in cellophane, in styrofoam, and also a pose where there was a Salvador Dali type eye behind them. And so when he had his next photo session, it was a bit of a mystery as to what it would be. And at that particular photo session, the good news for us is that the Beatles book had one of their photographers, Nigel Dixon, at that photo session. And so he took a lot of candid shots of the Beatles, and he took pictures of the Beatles getting their portrait taken by Whitaker, because Whitaker needed to get the portrait taken. And by seeing Dixon's pictures, we learned that Whitaker had an assistant with a camera, which explains why for the Butcher session you have both color and black and white film. And that's because there were two photographers, one shooting color, one shooting black and white. So we know that. And then Dixon also took some pictures of Whitaker lining up some of the shots, like the birdcage shot or the nails shot into John's head.
Right.
So we have a lot of visual information that we did not have before. And I think that's pretty cool. The we also now know that the trunk session was taken on a particular date. And Mark Lewison and I were able to kind of put that together. And one of the key pieces that was missing was that the Bavarian Beatles store, and I think Frank's the guy's name, he had some images on his website, and they were fascinating because one of them was Bob Whitaker setting up a trunk photo. And I asked him what else he had, and he sent me more images, and I said, what's the source of this? And he said, well, these were taken with Thomas Beale's camera. And so, of course, I had to show my ignorance of all things German and ask who Thomas Beale was. And he was one of the chief writers for Bravo magazine. And it all fell into place because the Beatles were going to be playing in Germany shortly thereafter. So it would make sense for Thomas Beale to interview the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
So when I gave that information to Mark Lewison, we were able to determine that there were 2 dates around that time when the Beatles had interviews at NEMS, at Brian's office. And of course, we know from the trunk cover photo it was taken at Brian's office. I was able to rule out one of them because it was from a different magazine being present that day. So that meant it had to be on this particular date. So we determined the day that the Butcher photos were taken. So that was kind of a good bit of information.
The trunk photos.
There also were several memos that hit the market, capital memos in letters. In Gary Hine of his group, Fab Four, was it Fab Collectibles or whatever Gary calls himself. Anyway, Gary was a big help because he provided that information to me. And with that, I was able to really kind of put together the story, and I'll be telling it at the fest. But the interesting thing is that you have the photo session of the Butcher cover and all these other crazy images first. Then you have a photo session at NEMS. And Tony Barrow had told me that this photo session was sort of impromptu, that the Beatles were going to be there anyway. And the idea was, well, look, as long as we have the boys together, why don't we get Whitaker to take some pictures? And I think part of that may have been that Brian was rightly concerned about the last photo session. He just wanted some more shots of the boys.
Mm-hmm.
So the other interesting thing from these photos that I was able to license from the Beatles Bavarian store is that you see Ringo and George looking at some pictures. And when you blow it up, the pictures they're looking at are black and white shots from the Butcher session.
Okay.
So you see the Beatles seeing them there, but what's really cool is there's this shot of Whitaker with this excited look on his face and John with this gleeful look on his face. So that the Beatles are seeing the Butcher shots for the first time, and John is really excited about it. On the other hand, there's a shot of Thomas Beale and Paul sitting down at a desk looking at them, and both of them look sullen and perplexed would be about the best way to describe it. So we have that wonderful information, and we know that at about this time, Capitol was putting together its new Beatles album. And as was the case with the prior few albums, Capitol requested a photo from Brian. This I'm deducing, I don't have a memo proving that, but that had to be the case. And Brian sends them the trunk photo. So Capitol dutifully uses the picture sent to them by Brian.
You said the trunk photo?
The trunk photo, yeah.
Huh, okay.
Trunk is first, folks.
Really?
Trunk?
Huh.
Yes. Okay. I told you I was turning this story on its head.
Yeah.
So what happens is they get the trunk photo and they make a design with it. And it has a blue rectangle on the side.
Mm-hmm.
It has the Beatles in white and the song titles in yellow. And the album's called Yesterday and Today. Now, if you take a look, and of course it's hard to do this in a podcast, but for those of you out there that have your Beatles collection handy, take a look at an image of either in one of my books or your collection of the Yesterday single on Capitol. At the top, it has a blue rectangle with the Beatles in white and the songs in yellow. So effectively, what Capitol did was they wanted to be playing on the effect that this album is called Yesterday and Today, and it's a pun. Yesterday is originally in quotes there because it's a song title. They even use the same color scheme as the Yesterday picture sleeve. And so that's done. And everything is ready to go for this album. And they need to get the cover going. There is a memo sending this blue trunk cover to Queen's Litho for production. And in it, however, there's a handwritten PS, and it says PS to Barry. I was able to determine that Barry is Barry Cohn of Queen's Litho. And basically what the memo says is, do not begin printing until you hear from me next Monday. There is a problem with the Beatles manager, meaning there's a problem with Brian. What we can deduce from this memo is that Brian did something he hadn't done before. He wanted to see the album cover and approve it, and that was causing a delay. So Capitol sends him the album cover, and he looks at it, and he doesn't like it, which is kind of strange because Brian was the one that sent him the photo to begin with.
And this is the trunk cover.
Yes. And apparently Brian maybe didn't like the garish colors on the thing, so we just don't know why he didn't like it, but he didn't like it. And so Capitol needs to come up with a new design, and they have their art department come up with alternate trunk designs, which I'll call alternates 1, 2, and 3. And in the meantime, one of them has sort of a blue background. It tilts the photo. Alternate design 2 has the white background and only has, I've cut out the trunk and the Beatles, and it has the group's name and song titles, not in that psychedelic font that you see on the trunk cover, but in block letters. And another alternate design has 2 images of the Beatles in the trunk, which is really bizarre. But they send Brian a mock-up of alternate design 2, not the actual design, but a mock-up, just saying, hey, Brian, look, if you don't like all those colors, we can use a white background and we can put in song titles.
And you can see that on page 281 of your book. Brian looking at that cover as it looks like a Chiswick house.
That's the significance. Yeah. The day before Brian looks at that cover, Paul and the Beatles are doing the video at Abbey Road Studios for Paperback Writer in Rain. At the beginning of the video, Paul is holding up something. If you look closely, you can see it in the book by expanding it. That's the great thing about digital. If you expand it, you see Paul is looking at color transparencies of the Butcher cover. And so that creates an interesting situation where Paul is looking at the color transparencies. So the next day, they're at Chiswick's Garden, as we well know. And Brian is looking at this boring trunk cover. John and Paul, the day before, have seen the color transparencies. And so it should come as no great shock to us when John looks at that boring trunk cover, and says to Brian, oh, no, don't use that for the cover. Use the Butcher photo for the cover. And that's how it comes about. It's certainly not Paul. It's John. If you look at the anthology book and the quotes about the Butcher cover, John's the one who says, I really pushed for that cover. And believe me, it had to have been John. So here's what happens. Brian, we don't have the dialogue, but we know Brian had to have been horrified by this. And so he's trying to argue with John and Paul. But remember, by 66, Brian wasn't running the show. John and Paul were running the show. Yeah. So Brian's job was then to talk to Capitol and insist on this. So he sends it to Capitol. I interviewed George Osakwe, who was head of the art department at Capitol, and I interviewed Alan Livingston, who was president of Capitol. So I know what happened at that end. What happens at that end is Osakwe loves the picture. He gets all excited about it. He uses a psychedelic font for the album title, Yesterday and Today. And he goes ahead and gets this done. The sales department sees it and they freak out. And they go to Alan and they say, this can't be the cover. And Alan agrees it can't be. And he gets on the phone with Brian, and Brian insists that it be the cover. And so his idea is to do a limited run with the Butcher cover. But the production department knows that isn't feasible. So what they do, and once again, there is a letter that, I have in the book, and the letter is sent to Barry Cohn of Queen's Litho, and it includes alternate design 1, alternate design 2, alternate design 3, and also the Butcher cover. and 2 Beach Boy things, which were not relevant to discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And there is also a letter that is sent to a guy with Capitol Records who is based in New York. And Barry Cohn is supposed to get those images to this guy in Capitol in New York. Now, why does Capitol's New York guy need it? Because, once again, confirming the timing with Mark Lewison, as I suspected, Mark tells me I'm spot on. Brian was in New York at that time to promote the Beatles' upcoming 1966 tour. So, Brian's in New York, and this Capitol employee, Tom Morgan's job is to meet with Brian and ideally get him to pick one of those alternate designs. But if he insists on the butcher cover, so be it. And so Brian insists on the butcher cover. So Capitol goes ahead at Brian's insistence, even though Brian hates the cover and is worried what it'll do to the group's image. Capitol goes ahead, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and rather than doing a few hundred like Livingston suggests, does a complete run of the butcher cover. You know, and their sales forecasts on this album were 1.2 million. So they do all these butcher covers, and then, as you know, Capitol sends it to radio stations and distributors, and everybody screams about it, and the butcher cover comes to a halt. And now, Alan Livingston must give Brian the bad news. Brian's petrified because he's worried John and Paul will be upset with him, but relieved that it's not going to happen. And Alan asks him, what was this about? And Brian tells him, as per my interview that I have with him, it's about their feelings of the Vietnam War. And where Paul gets wrong credit for this is a few years after I interviewed Alan Livingston, Mojo Magazine interviewed Alan Livingston. And in the interview, Alan Livingston says, Paul told me that the purpose of the cover was about war. And, of course, Alan, a few years after interviewing me, was a little bit older and a little bit further from it and, quite frankly, a little bit confused. And that's how Mojo started the false statement that Paul was the one who pushed for the butcher cover. It was not Paul, it was John.
There was a press conference where someone, I believe, asked them about it, and they said, "What's the meaning of this cover?" And John said it's as relevant as Vietnam. Wasn't that?
Yes, he said it's relevant as Vietnam. If Americans can take the war, they can take this cover. Mm-hmm. And of course, Americans in 1966 could accept the Vietnam War, but not the cover.
Yes,
one of the other interesting things is Ralph J. Gleason, writing for the San Francisco, I think it's Chronicle, later Rolling Stone, said that he was not disturbed by it at all, felt it was, pop art satire and black humor, and said, isn't it strange that we have this horrified and shrill reaction to the cover when real babies in Vietnam are having their heads blown off and being seared by napalm. So Ralph Gleason and John were on the same wavelength on that. So interesting Bruce, stuff.
How many of these got out into the stores?
Well, into the stores, hardly any, because here's what happened. Capitol had, close to at least 500,000, if not 1 million, at that point in time, but at least 500,000 with their 25 distributors nationally. And Wallace's Music Store, which, here's a little fun thought, the guy was one of the co-founders of Capitol, so lo and behold, that store would get Beatles product a day or two ahead of everyone else. Well, they got the butcher cover, and apparently some copies were sold there. Capitol was able to pull the album back from their distribution centers, but what they weren't able to do quick enough was some job rackers who would put it in drugstores, in places like that. And so you could have bought the album at, say, a 5 and 10 drugstore somewhere, possibly even a Sears Roebuck somewhere, and I think some were sold by Sears. So some got out, and then when the recall hit, those people pulled them immediately. But it was possible to buy the butcher cover if you were in the right place at the right time.
I know someone who did, and about 2 weeks later, she brought it back because she wanted the same cover as all her friends had. It's so sad.
That's a great story.
I was going to ask how many people actually returned it to Capitol.
I asked Alan Livingston. I asked Alan Livingston that, and he said very few, if any. Now, of course, we still need to talk about the trunk cover. And basically, George Osaki was told you need to come up with a replacement cover. Well, George didn't want to use the one that Brian rejected, and he didn't want to use the boring one with the block letters. So what he did was he took alternate design 2, which was a trunk with a white background, and he shifted the positioning of the trunk slightly to the left. And in doing so, left the upper right corner available to use what they already had, the black overlay of the album title and the song titles in that psychedelic font. And that's exactly how it was done. The digital book shows you essentially how he did it. And Osaki, when I interviewed him, confirmed that's what he did. So what you have to remember is the order is trunk, butcher, trunk. And I know that, is surprising to many people.
Yeah.
Now, the digital book has all of the essential photos from the butcher session, not just shots of the, the raw meat in that, but the, the photos of, the bird cage and the nails and the Beatles on the floor with the baby doll parts, and also explains the inspiration from that was Hans Bellmer's book, Die Puppy, which in German translates to The Doll. And the book has a picture of the cover of that book, The Doll, which shows, a part of a doll that's been cut up. So, you get a lot of images and things that you probably haven't seen before, but certainly not in one place. And then it also has, all the different trunk designs and sessions, pictures from the trunk session that were taken with Thomas Beale's camera, including some shots, that Thomas Beale is in, that obviously were taken by someone, when he just handed his camera to them and said, hey, take my picture. They weren't doing selfies in those days.
Yeah.
So how many copies actually went out of the butcher cover before it was returned?
Well, we know that they sent out, thousands of promotional copies that went out. And we know Capitol employees, even though they would be fired if it was discovered that they did so, grabbed a bunch of copies. So the number of First State butchers out there, it's hard to say, but it's got to be in the thousands. And then the number of covers that Capitol was destroying the butcher covers until somebody got the bright idea of, look, there's nothing wrong with the cardboard and there's nothing wrong with the back of the album cover. What if we paste over the slick for the butcher cover, by using the trunk cover and paste over that? And there are hundreds of thousands of those out there, tons of them out there. Not as many as ones without it, but there are literally hundreds of thousands of paste overs out there, or potential butcher peels, as we say. Just one thing that I, just found out recently, and that was that a sealed butcher cover stereo, and not even a Livingston butcher, went at auction for $125,000.
Wow.
And I just found that out today, which really blew me away because, that is significant. The highest Livingston butcher stereo sale was at about $80,000. This tops it at $125,000, which means theoretically a Livingston butcher would go for even more. Stereo Livingston butcher, that is.
Yeah.
There are only 4 of those known in existence, and nobody's selling them these days.
Right. Wow.
Can I change the subject and ask a question about the Hollywood Bowl album?
Yes.
They basically went back and forth on this. Capitol was going to do it. They recorded it. Then they didn't put it out because George Martin apparently didn't like it. Then they put it out in the 70s. And then there's been the delay. It's practically at the top of everybody's wish list for a CD version, and there has been none.
Yeah.
So why the back and forth on this, the way it's gone, Bruce?
I think it will eventually happen, but you have to understand the way that Apple has done things. They take a very systematic, one thing at a time approach. And if you look at what they put out has been of the highest quality. The only real legitimate criticism that people can make, and of course you can make a lot of criticisms, but the real legitimate one is, we'd like to see more things come out sooner than they do. So there are other things that have taken priority. For example, this year is the year of the Ron Howard movie. That's a big deal.
Right.
So I wouldn't expect, if Apple is true to form, I wouldn't expect other things rushed out this year. And in the past, if you look at things, and I'm not basing this on inside information, I'm basing this on the pattern that you see from Apple. Last year was the one videos. And people might say, gee, it was 10 years too late. But look, it was great. Everything was cleaned up beautifully.
But so, Bruce, in your experience discussing things with Apple, how do they conceive of human life expectancy? I mean, one thing a year is very nice, but there's a lot of things.
Look, I understand that, and in my talks, I have suggested more ambitious schedules, and it's possible that at some point in time there may be an acceleration of it. And I think that the things that you keep in mind, yes, the life expectancy of your fan base, and also the fact that physical format is something that is, moving to be a niche market now.
Right.
In that there always will be a market for physical format, but it will continue to shrink. Not only do people like first generation fans, do we die, but as we get older, we downsize.
Yeah.
So if you're moving from a big house with the wife and kids for all these years and the kids are gone and you and the wife are wondering why we're in a 4-bedroom house anymore, and you downsize to a small condo or relatively small, then you have less space for stuff, and physical product takes up space. So that's another factor. And I think these things are being made aware. I think the people at Apple are aware of them, and I do think that, not based on inside information, but just based on general observation, I think we will see in the next coming years, and I don't mean the next 2 decades, but in the next, coming years, some of the things that Beatle fans have been looking for. Jonathan Clyde of Apple has as much said so, that we know what the fans want and we want to get it out. So I think that these things will happen. But as I've said, based on the way things go, I would not expect anything this year other than the Ron Howard film.
Well, I would never downsize my Beatle collection anyway.
I'm glad to hear that, and and believe me, it's an interesting thing. I do expect that there will be things that will make Beatle fans very happy in the coming years, and I'm not talking a 20-year time frame, but I'm not talking about a 2-year time frame either. So somewhere in between that time frame.
So what about? But you were gonna. I asked you about the Hollywood Bowl specifically.
Yeah.
Is that what was the back and forth on that? Because, they were going to do it, and then they apparently didn't like it, and then they put it out.
What happened back in the '60s was that George Martin felt that the studio recordings were better, so why should we put it out? Capitol, from having released live albums of the Kingston Trio that were big sellers and getting ready to release a live Beach Boys album, knew that the album would sell in the millions and was extremely frustrated when they were not allowed to put it out. And they recorded in '65, and once again, the Beatles management said no. And finally in the '70s, they were allowed to do something. George Martin got involved and did kind of a best of the Hollywood Bowl album, where he took things from both the '64 and '65 concerts and put them out. I, like many other people, have heard the '64 concert in its entirety, and yeah, there are 3 songs where maybe they miss a note or 2 on the vocals, but the excitement of the concert outweighs, to me, whatever shortcomings there were, and yeah, I'd love to see it come out.
I agree.
And I'm sure I'm not alone in that, and I'm sure Apple is aware of that.
I have a question about the Butcher cover, just going back to that. You were talking about Brian Epstein approving the cover, I guess mainly to please John. But didn't Paul have any say? Because I just can't picture Paul approving that, even though he was a part of it, being the most image-conscious of the Beatles,
I think Paul got into it because, John was talking about it, and just, in a temporary lapse of judgment of the Beatles image, I think Paul was like, oh, yeah, that's fab. That's, fine. And George and Ringo went along because they knew, quite frankly, their votes wouldn't have mattered in this case, that John and Paul were excited about it. And if you look at the anthology quotes, George says, this is a stupid thing, And then, Ringo says, well, one of these things happens while life passes you by type thing. Paul, why did the Beatles pose in butcher smocks to begin with? George and Ringo certainly weren't terribly enthused about it. John was, Salvador Dali, type things, surreal type things. Mm-hmm. Paul went along for it, if you read his anthology quote, because we tended to do what photographers told us to do. Deso Hoffman told us to wear eyeglasses because pictures with us wearing eyeglasses would help sell, Beatle albums, Beatle pictures that would be put in eyeglass magazines, which would help sell Beatle albums. So Paul went along for it because he was the dutiful Beatle who wanted to please the photographer. And that's kind of the things you can kind of pull from the quotes from anthology.
George looks pretty happy in it. I mean, if you look at the butcher cover, he's standing behind the other three of them. He's got a big smile.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he says he was, and I believe George probably, it's I don't know if I'd quite call it a smile. It's more of a smirk than a smile, I think.
Okay.
But I take George at his word that he really wasn't all into it. Certainly in hindsight, he was very much against it. As he says, quite rightly, someone said, do we really need this on an album cover?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, speaking of other album covers, one of the other things that is in the digital book, because I know some of your listeners are saying, look, I have a print book. Why do I need something digital? I don't even own a digital book.
Right.
Well, there are, not only the Butcher stuff, but the original artwork for the Beatles story album is in there, which shows that they actually tore up photographs and pasted them on the board. The original artwork for Beatles 65, the Bob Whitaker Four Seasons montage. But what's interesting is there's an alternate cover design where the top primary photo was going to be shown in black silhouette only, and then Capitol thought better of it. And then for Beatles 6, we finally get the complete photo that was used on that cover. The cover's cropped, and in the book you see the complete photo. And not only that, but you find out that that photo was part of an elaborate photo session for Fabulous magazine that involved two photographers, and that these images were used on 4 consecutive issues during the holiday season.
It's funny because when you see the whole photo, it looks like they're cutting a birthday cake or something.
It's not a birthday cake.
What is it?
It's a Christmas cake.
Oh, all right.
And
Same
the reason you know it's a Christmas cake is because those red things you see around the cake are crackers.
Crackers.
You pull the things and they pop.
Right.
And also, if you look at some of the other pictures of the cake, including something where John has a piece and stuff on his head, it says Merry Christmas. It's a cake decoration that says Merry Christmas.
So, but without the cake, you can't.
People that have said it's John's birthday cake are totally wrong. It's not John's birthday cake. It's a Christmas cake.
Yeah. Without the cake, which is the cover of the album, you don't get the cake at all. I always sort of wondered, what are they holding there? I mean,
it looked like an umbrella or an ice
or a golf club.
A microphone cord. But you see, readers who buy the digital book now can have their cake and eat it too.
Really? Yes, which they're doing on the next page, 162.
Bruce, let me ask something else. In the book, you say that there's always been the criticism about the Capitol albums being, how Capitol rejiggered them from the British albums, but you said that Meet the Beatles was perfect for America. Why?
Yeah. First of all, look, the Beatles had 14 songs on their albums. In America, we did 11 or 12 for financial reasons, and the short story is royalties are computed differently. In America, it's per song, and in the UK, per disc, where you divide it, and each publisher gets a pro rata share. So in this case, they weren't going to have a 14-song album for With the Beatles. And here's the thing about Capitol. Kids traditionally did not buy albums. A big selling album was 250,000 units. And Capitol's philosophy was hit singles make hit albums. And so they had to put I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand on that album. That had to be on the album. People who miss the point say I Saw Her Standing There was randomly pulled from the first album. No, that's not true. The hit single, and they knew it was going to be a hit single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, I Saw Her Standing There, to open the album because hit singles make hit albums. They were familiar with This Boy because they were sent the single, I Want to Hold Your Hand. They chose not to use it as the B-side because they wanted to play it safe and have rockers on both sides. But they knew This Boy was a brilliant song. So that was the third track. Then they took, in the running order of With the Beatles, every song from With the Beatles that was written by a Beatle, either John and Paul or George's Don't Bother Me. That got them up to 11. And then to throw in a song that Mom and Dad could even love, Till There Was You, a ballad from Music Man. And that was how the album was put together. It's brilliant. Now, Beatles' second album is a pieces parts album. You had your 5 leftover rockers from the first album. You had, She Loves You and I'll Get You. You had Thank You Girl. And Capitol had 2 songs that had yet to come out in the UK, with, Long Tall Sally and I Call Your Name. Now, although this is a pieces parts album, even people that hate what Capitol did to the catalog will tell you, begrudgingly, and sometimes even admittedly and glowingly, the Beatles' second album is a brilliant rock and roll album. So, Capitol's 2 for 2. Not bad for a company that supposedly butchered the Beatles. Something new, yeah, when you compare it to the soundtrack album or what could have been, yeah. And then when you get to Beatles 65 and Beatles 6, which I call, Beatles for Sale Part 1 and Part 2, okay. But then, if you look at what they did with Rubber Soul in the UK is a masterpiece. Rubber Soul in the US is a different listening experience and also a masterpiece that has a folk rock sound.
Yep.
If you really want to get on the Capitol bandwagon, let's go to Magical Mystery Tour. In England, it is a double EP. Capitol puts it on one side of an album in a running order that probably makes more sense than the EPs, and on the other side puts on 5 songs from singles. And it is just a much better listening experience. You're not getting up and flipping records over all the time. I think if you count the singles, you would have had to flip the records about a half a dozen times, maybe more, to have that just flipped once. So much so that 9 years later, EMI realized it was better and put it out, and it also is in the core Apple catalog. So here's the thing. Capitol did not butcher the Beatles. Capitol marketed the Beatles. What they did was no different than what any other record company in the U.S. did, and it was no different than what other record companies did with the Beatles albums in other countries. So I think Capitol's taken a bad rap over the years. Now, that doesn't mean that, we should ignore the Beatles catalog. I mean, after all, in the UK, it's what they wanted. And certainly that is the official catalog. But to ignore what Capitol did and to just, toe the party line of Capitol butchered the Beatles is really not being accurate or honest.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you make a good point there, Bruce, and I certainly would agree with everything you just said. My only question is that apart from what you were saying about Meet the Beatles and especially Magical Mystery Tour as well, was there really much thought in the sequencing of the songs on a lot of those albums, like Beatles 65, Beatles 6? Because if you look at the British counterparts, the sequencing in many cases is almost the same.
Yes.
You've always got a group of songs connected, whether it's 5, 6, 7 in a row. Did they really think about what songs belong on each album?
I think what they were doing was, look, we're going to be doing some things differently because we're adding singles. But the running order really works. George Martin did a good job on that, so why should we randomly change the running order? And that's a very good point you make, is that, Capitol did not go in and throw everything around. If Meet the Beatles is the exact same running order, except it opens up with 3 songs that weren't on the album and drops 5 rock and roll cover songs. Now, bear in mind, Capitol's decision to drop those songs, they were probably thinking at the time, we want to showcase the songwriting talents of the members of the group, which makes perfect sense. And furthermore, why would an American want to hear the Beatles do Roll Over Beethoven when they've got the Chuck Berry, single somewhere? And of course, when Roll Over Beethoven as a Canadian single was imported into the U.S. in large numbers, Capitol realized Americans want to hear the Beatles doing Roll Over Beethoven and these other songs. And on the cover to the Beatles' second album, it even says featuring Roll Over Beethoven and She Loves You. They wanted to release Roll Over Beethoven as the follow-up single to I Want to Hold Your Hand until George Martin said, guys, would you just wait a week or two? We've got something new called Can't Buy Me Love. And I believe Can't Buy Me Love came out in the States about a week or two ahead of the UK release. So, George Martin wanted that to be the follow-up single, and they allowed Capitol to put it out sooner, so Capitol would quickly have a follow-up single. They wanted a follow-up single because VJ had put out Please Please Me and was following, and had already followed that up with Twist and Shout and Do You Want to Know a Secret? So by that time, Capitol desperately wanted to put out a new single.
Now we've touched a bit on the digital books, or at least the third digital book, the Capitol Albums book. But and of course this is tough to do in audio only. But maybe you can give us just a kind of brief schematic of, because there are now 3 books of yours. Your first 3 books now are all available in digital form, and maybe you can give us a brief description.
Right. Well, the idea behind it was that these books had sold out and were going for big bucks in the secondary market. The VJ book, $300, $400, $500. Capitol books, well over $100. In some of my younger fans of Beatle books, it asked me, why don't you put it out on digital? I couldn't economically do it as a print edition book because the technology had changed, the plates had been destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, and it just would have cost a fortune. And so when I got the idea to do it, I thought, look, I don't want to make people rebuy the same thing twice. I want to give them good value for their money. So if I'm going to do this as a digital book, it's going to be revised and expanded. And so as I started doing the VJ thing, I realized there were all sorts of new things I'd learned. I had gotten, the guy who had done the 4 faces that you see on several VJ picture sleeves and album covers. Now I knew who he was, and I knew how much he was paid for that design and all sorts of other things. And then I began to realize one of the cool things about digital was, you could have internal links to where, when you made a reference to something, someone could tap that reference and it'd take them to that page. And then we added a sidebar where we had something called the Get Back key, where you could tap the Get Back key and it would take you back to where you once were reading, if not where you once belonged. And so, that worked out well. And you could expand the size of images. So you could take a look at the image of the From Me to You single by Del Shannon and expand it to where you could clearly see the songwriting credit was McCartney-Lennon and things like that. And, with tons of new information. And the other great thing about digital was, look, when you do a print edition book, once it's in print, it's there. And if there are errors in it, those errors don't go away. But digital book, we had like version 1.1. So some people spot some errors. They email me. I send them a no prize, and we do version 1.1, and we correct some of those. And we let people who bought the book know, of a download, hey, there's a new version out you can download. We did a major expansion of the VJ book because about a year after the VJ book came out, I was able to get the VJ singles and the album introducing the Beatles certified gold and platinum by the RIAA.
Right.
So we added that information to the book. So if you bought the digital book when it first came out, you were sent a notice of, hey, there's a new download with new information. So that flexibility is really great. Now, the Capitol album books, when you're doing a print edition, you've got a real page count issue. Each page costs money, and you can't add a page or 2. Things are done by signatures. So sometimes if you add a couple of pages, you're adding 16 pages. So, it becomes a real issue. With a digital book, page count is pretty much irrelevant. So I was able to add more information on, the history of Capitol Records, more information on the history of the 45 RPM single, which is part 1 of the Capitol book. And I added several pages on every non-Beatles or every British single that Capitol released pre-Beatles. And, had stories, images of most of the records, stories behind the records, and a chart that gave the sales figures for these records. Was also able to add information about the jukebox singles that Capitol put out that played at 33 and a third, and explain how that happened, the history of the jukeboxes, all kind of cool stuff that isn't purely Beatles, but if you're a first generation fan, you remember that stuff. For me, it was vindication. I remembered going into in New Orleans, you could go into bars as a kid, but bars or hamburger joints or restaurants where there were jukeboxes that had 5 album covers running along the top, 7-inch by 7-inch album covers. And for a quarter, you could play a side of that and hear 3 songs from the album. And it was nice when I did my research to see, the Seaberg Corporation put out that type of jukebox. And I found that ad in Billboard that showed me that TAC Amusement Company in New Orleans bought tons of those. So, my memories were validated, which is always kind of fun. The album book, we added a section on the history of the vinyl album, how that came about, explain where the term album came from. That came from the fact that you had 78s that had 2 songs, one on each side, not much playing time. And for classical works, what they would do would be to have it recorded over, several different 78s. It might be as many as 4 to 8 different 78s. And the discs themselves were put in these pages, and it was put together in what looked like a photo album, and they were called albums. So when Columbia invented the long play micro groove record, they were called albums because they didn't just have 2 songs on them. They had, 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 songs, as many as 16 on a Frank Sinatra album.
Yeah.
So, wow. A lot of interesting information that, you always wondered about. And now you know why they're called albums. And, and also the fact that Capitol was one of the first companies to license the 45 RPM technology from RCA, and also one of the first companies to license the long-playing microgroove technology from Columbia, and was actually the first label to issue things in all 3 formats, 78, 45, and LP. So Capitol was a very innovative company, and, it gets me really mad when people say Capitol didn't know what they were doing, Capitol butchered the Beatles, and all of this other stuff. It's simply not true. When I was in graduate business school, I concentrated in finance and marketing. So, it was fun to see this. And you go over history, Capitol was the first record company to do something really unique, to market their product directly to the consumer. Prior to the Beatles campaign, for the most part, record companies took out ads in Cashbox, in Billboard, and engaged in payola. Their thinking was, if DJs get the records and play them, and if distributors have the records to send to record stores, we've done our job. We think second nature now. Of course you're going to market to the consumer. No one had done that prior to Capitol with the Beatles campaign.
Bruce, how would you and you kind of referred to this earlier, but I'm going to ask it again. There's always the criticism about the fact that we've been waiting so long for things, and from the point of view of the fact that you've had some dealings with them, how aware are they of what's going on the internet? How aware are they of what's being said about them? And you mentioned that they're aware of what fans want, but I mean, really, how aware are they? Especially when we talk about, the brain trust themselves, how aware are they?
Well, I think when I say Apple, I think Apple in the sense of the Apple office in London is aware of these things. And, the Apple office in London is one thing, and then there is John's widow, Yoko, and George's widow, Olivia, and there's Paul, and there's Ringo. And so anything that Apple does is going to need approval of the surviving Beatles and Yoko and Olivia. And so that adds an extra step in the decision-making process that you may not have where a record company has complete autonomy. So you have a multi-layered thing here. If you look at it, and once again, this isn't inside information. These are observations that anyone can see. You have Universal Music Group, which owns the masters. And Universal, when it was Capitol and EMI, and I'm speculating on this because the litigation itself, these cases were sealed, they were settlements, and the settlements have never been made public. But I think it's safe to assume that as part of the settlement, Apple was given complete artistic control over the issuance of the masters that are still owned by EMI and Capitol, are now being owned by Universal Music Group. So you now have...
The Beatles lawyer, Leonard Marks, in New York, actually confirmed that for me. So it's not, you don't even have to say it's surmise. That's what it is. Yeah.
I do appreciate that, Alan. I
Anytime.
appreciate you bailing me out on that. So now we know, because I don't want to be responsible for leaking anything. I'm not leaking anything.
No.
So what I'm saying is you now have a situation where you've got three different decision makers, whereas normally a record company is one decision maker. So I do think that that is one of the reasons that things do not come as quickly as a case where if you had an autonomous record company that could just say, okay, we're going to reissue the Kinks catalog and this is what we're going to do. And we'll see if Ray Davies approves of it, if he wants to be involved, and we own the masters, and if he doesn't like it, tough, we're going to do it. Universal cannot do that. And so now you're dealing with Universal, Apple, and the Apple board, as it were. So that's three layers. Mm-hmm. Maybe people now will have a better understanding and sympathy or appreciation for the situation. So that may not be a happy answer, but that's reality.
Right. Thank you, Bruce.
Bruce, do you have any plans for further books, either in physical or digital form, besides refurbishing the back catalog? Do you have new projects that you're working on?
Not at this time. I've been pretty busy with the law practice. I do some consulting work for Universal and Apple, and right now that consulting work is not a lot of time. In the future, it might be more. I don't know whether it will be or not. In the event it would be more, that would leave less time for me, obviously, to do book products, because at this stage of my life, I don't think I'm going to be practicing from law anytime terribly soon. My grandfather retired from the practice of law at 91. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'll be practicing law 30 more years or not, but anyway, I'm certainly not going to be retiring from the practice of law within the next year or two. So I don't foresee any new book projects. And quite frankly, I've covered the American records. I've covered how Beatlemania evolved in America, and I've covered the British records. So I don't know what else. People make suggestions to me. One suggestion is a fan club book or one on merchandising. One suggestion was do one on all the Beatles lawsuits. To which I replied, oh, yes, let me do a book that will get Apple, Universal, Capitol, EMI, Paul, Ringo, Yoko, Olivia, and probably a bunch of other people mad at me. So that book will never happen.
Actually, somebody's done one of those, or at least a couple of them.
There are a few of them out there now, and I'm just glad that my name's not in any of them. And if any of the powers that Beatle are listening, those are not pen names that I used. I have not written such a book, and I never will write such a book.
Okay.
And when I'm dead, there won't be a manuscript.
Do they seem accurate to you? Have you read them?
Parts of them are accurate, and there's some that are bitterly disappointing. There was a book that some guy who used to work at Capitol or was a lawyer for Capitol, that he put it out and he wrote it off the top of his head, and it shows. I won't give its title, but it's highly recommended not to buy.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
So, Bruce, this has been great, and looking forward to the digital versions of the rest of the collection. What's next?
Well,
Conquer America.
The next one would probably be the Apple book, and of course, I have to plug my website, which is just beatle.net. And there are also some fun articles and stuff, and I'll be adding more articles on it. So even if you don't go to the website to buy the books, check out the articles. It's free. There's a wonderful one where shortly after April Fool's Day, check out the Paul McCartney Admits Death Hoax article that was originally published on April Fool's Day many years back, and a few other things. There's also one called Remember the Titans, which explains the group The Titans, who are on that MGM Beatles album, and a lot of fun stuff like that.
Okay, so if you want to contact us, we can be reached by email at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We do
Very
read your
good.
letters. We sometimes respond. I should take this opportunity to say that, we've had a number of letters about our not having done a show about George Martin right after he died. And the fact is that we had done a show about George Martin for his 90th birthday. We devoted a full show to him, and our feeling was basically that we would just end up repeating what we had just said a few weeks earlier. What we probably should have done is refer you guys back to that show and give it another listen if you had missed it the first time. But yeah, we had, that was our tribute to George Martin, and please give it a listen if you haven't heard it.
It's on Podbean and it's on YouTube. I'm looking back to see which one it was. But yeah, it was
on iTunes
number
as well.
165. Yeah, it's on iTunes as well. It's number 165.
Okay. But, we are happy to field your comments, any suggestions you have for shows you'd like to hear us do. We're interested in that, too. You can also follow us on Twitter at the @ Things We Said Fab. And we all have various Facebook pages. Steve, do you want to mention yours?
I have my own personal Facebook page, and I have a Beatles news group, Beatles News and Commentary, that you're welcome to join and talk about anything you want.
Okay. And Ken?
You can always visit my website for weekly Beatles trivia and interviews with lots of people connected to the Beatles, including Bruce, who I've interviewed before, and that's on my website too, kenmichaelsradio.com.
Okay, you have any contests coming up?
Every single week there's a regular contest where you can win one of 9 prizes, including books, CDs, DVDs, the new DVD for How I Won the War. Actually, I should say Blu-ray for How I Won the War. We had Jude Kessler on our show a few weeks back. Her first book called Should Have Been There. Her narrative biography on John you could win. All kinds of things. The McCartney remasters, the Beatles 1, the CD and DVD. So that's all on the website. Go check it out, kenmichaelsradio.com.
And Al?
On Facebook, Al Sussman. On Twitter, at ASUSS49. And rather than do the usual nonsense that people do on Facebook and Twitter, I try to give some information, and so I do kind of almanac-y type things, and sometimes I'm able to find out some interesting little nuggets, like the fact that today is the 110th birthday of B. Benaderet.
Oh my.
Who among you knows who B. Benaderet
Oh, I know.
I do.
I do.
Okay,
Petticoat Junction.
right.
And also she
Betty
was
from,
in the...
Betty from the Flintstones.
And she was on the Burns and Allen show.
Exactly.
It was.
And you might have...
And I'm the youngest one here. I'm the youngest
Right.
one here, too.
Well, there you go. Okay, so thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.